If you've seen some of my videos in the past, I've tubed a whole bunch of trees, used tree tubes, and those were predominantly for, well, they were all for hardwoods, but that doesn't necessarily work real well for fruit trees. And I've just planted a whole bunch of pear trees. So I decided to cage these, and there's some pros and cons with tubing versus caging and vice versa. Tubing, it's cheaper and it's quicker to implement or quicker to put in. But on the back side of that, each year you've got to prune the branches inside the tubes, you got to clear out the leaf litter. It may not be quite as durable or protective in some regards as the fencing, but overall it is a good option. It's a cheaper option and a good option for, I think, for hardwoods. It's something to consider anyway. So this is one of the tree tubes that I got, and in this particular one there's a chestnut tree. But I just want to show you or tell you kind of the maintenance that I do. So in the spring and in the fall, I will weed it and basically open it up and figure out if there's grass growing or weeds growing in here. I did that for all of these already, but in addition to weeding it multiple times, and I've done that, I do it 2 times a year, but even still, these weeds and this grass can easily choke out these trees, and I've lost a few to that. So you not only got to weed, but you also, in the winter, you got to prune. And in addition to pruning, you got to remove all the leaves that are in the tubes. So these tubes are a little bit more high maintenance per se than fencing, but it's a lot cheaper to do if you've got a lot of trees to plant. It doesn't take as long to tube these as it does to put a fence in like I've done here. So I just kind of want to show you the difference between tubing and fencing. Now both generally work, but once this tree gets thick enough, you're going to have to remove this tube. And that might be 5 years, depending on tree species. It might be 5-6 years, something like that. Whereas the fencing you can leave go, and that fencing is a little bit less maintenance. You don't have to prune as much or at all if you don't want, but not only that, you don't have to worry about the weeds and the grass quite as much. It does help to do that, but you don't have to do it quite as often or worry about it as much. So higher upfront costs with the fencing, but with the tubes, you got to have a little bit more maintenance with it, otherwise you might lose your trees. And as I mentioned, when you take these tubes off, there's a chance that a buck might rub it, or a rabbit might girdle it even still. I wouldn't, if it's thick enough, probably not a rabbit, but it can happen, particularly with fruit trees. So those are some considerations with tubes versus fencing. So with fencing, generally I like to fence fruit trees, and the reason is they're a little bit more prone to fire blight and some of those diseases where it tends to happen in tubes because that water and humidity collects in the tubes, and it just creates that environment where it's tough for apple trees and some pear trees and that to thrive. So that's why I like to fence fruit trees. The other reason for fencing is, in the long run, it's a lot less maintenance, or a little bit less maintenance anyway. You still got to water them, but as far as weeding, when you've got tubes, you've got to go in there, you've got to at least 2 times a year, sometimes 3, sometimes 4, and go and cut and pull weeds out of the tubes, otherwise it can choke those young trees, particularly when they're young. When they get 3, 4, it's not as big of a deal, but so it's a little bit less maintenance. And then with tubes, you got to prune the limbs that are down low quite often, otherwise it'll choke out the tree. And then also in the winter, you've got to either collect the leaves that drop to the ground, or you've got to pull some of the leaves off. Like chestnuts, they hold their leaves pretty much all year, whereas persimmons, they kind of drop, and you got to get them from the bottom and scoop them out, take them out. So it's not quite that. I don't know if you can hear that turkey in the background. Turkey season opens up next week, but there's not quite as much maintenance. Now you might have to spray a little bit with the weeds on the outside, but it's not going to be a major ordeal with this. You don't have to worry as much about pruning the limbs. Now at some point you're probably going to want to prune the low limbs, but if you don't get to it for a while, it's not as big of a deal. So that being said, the fencing is obviously a higher upfront cost, and it takes more time and labor to put in the fencing, but that's a consideration. You know, that time and that labor, there is some cost to that, but you know, it's just a trade-off. You know, how much you want to spend, how much time you want to spend maintaining it, that sort of thing. Now I know Bucktails from NH, he said he had some issues with bears and with moose with trees that he planted. Unfortunately, short of building a fort, you know, there's not a whole lot you can do other than pray. Fortunately, we don't have that dilemma here, but you know, it's some tough luck there for Don. But anyway, again, as I mentioned, if you have any questions, please leave them down in the section below. And thank you so much for watching.